Hey guys, welcome back to another Fundamentals Friday. So this Fundamentals Friday, we will be talking about probably one of the most heavily covered subjects on the internet when it comes to art. But I do think it's still a valuable thing for me to discuss because I do feel like I have a couple of unique insights that might help you guys out creating more dynamic and interesting poses. So the way I look at things and art in general is like everything technically has the same set of rules. Like as long as you know a couple of fundamental rules, you'll start noticing that there's a pattern and they actually are very applicable on all different kinds of subjects. So last Fundamentals Friday that I've done, we talked about, for example, composition, and the things in composition that we were talking about as well were depth and flow. Now, these are two things that I actually use myself to create these dynamic looking poses as well, because depth is immensely important and obviously flow kind of relates to the gesture of things. Now, what is depth in a scene, in a figure? Well, as you can see, I have 6 points that I actually would like to discuss during this video. The first one is going to be creating overlap for your poses. So that means actually playing around with what's in front of something else and what's behind of something else, and actually creating depth in our pose by insinuating more three-dimensional form. Perspective and rotation has the same application. It's all in service of creating something that feels nice and three-dimensional. Now, when it comes to action or to flow, action, rhythm, and balance is the three things that I try to keep in mind. And we will discuss all of these points one by one throughout this entire video. So I hope you're ready to get into some more deep dive information into something that is as complicated and as widely discussed as gesture drawing. Before we get started, I do want to first emphasize or define the things that we can use to our advantage to create these more dynamic poses. And the important thing is to actually learn how we can use these and learn how these are able to move. Like understanding the anatomy is obviously a big portion of this. And with anatomy, I don't necessarily mean the muscles. I'm talking about how the body is able to move, but actually more so how the body is not able to move. Now, what can we use to create an interesting pose? We have the shoulder and hip line, first of all, and then we have the three main volumes. So the shoulder and hip lines kind of speak for itself. When we connect our two shoulders and our two hips to with a line, then we end up with a very clear indication for a nice and dynamic gesture. Like just by arcing these or angling these against each other, we can immediately start creating more dynamic looking poses that are automatically much more interesting in the way we are actually constructing this figure. And you might have seen poses like this before in your art education, because this is actually fairly often talked about with as the idea of contrapost. Now, aside from the shoulders and the hips, we are also going to be talking about the three main volumes, and those are actually, in my opinion, more important. Why do we have these two pointers? Well, because the shoulders and the hips are obviously very much tied together to our chest and our pelvis. So from the moment I'm angling my hips, I'm also rotating my pelvis. From the moment I'm moving my shoulder, my chest is probably going to move with it. So those are two of the main volumes that we already have. And obviously the final volume would be the head, and with those three volumes alone we can actually create nice and interesting poses. We'll come back to this later to actually elaborate on how we can use these to our advantage, but for now let's actually have a look at the rest of our tips. So first of all, once again, we have depth, and depth, the way I use depth in a scene or in a figure is going to be with overlap, perspective, and rotation. Now, overlap is a fairly straightforward one. It means that we are going to try to create a pose, compose our figure in a way where we can actually angle things so that we have our limbs going in front of our chest and our chest going in front of the other limb, for example. On the left, we can see an example of a pose that, in my opinion, is fairly flawed. We have all of the separate elements that are just kind of isolated from each other. They are not interacting, they're not working together, they're not overlapping, and therefore it's a fairly flat and two-dimensional pose. But just kind of by slowly rotating, and again, that's where the rotation comes into play. By slowly rotating our chest in one direction, immediately we get 1, 2, 3 levels of overlap, because now this shoulder is in front of my chest and my chest is in front of the other shoulder, and that creates depth in our pose, which is also something that's very, very desirable. By rotating the hips in the opposite direction, we can accomplish a similar thing. It's obviously more subtle here, but we still have those 3 levels of depth that we can actually very much recognize, and once again do add to the just how interesting the figure and the pose actually is. So try to always play around with the orientation of our chest and our torso, and our pelvis and our head. Like, if those elements are basically pointing in the same direction, that's probably going to cause for a fairly flat looking pose. But from the moment we are actually kind of arcing those in different directions, then we can really emphasize somewhat of a twist basically to the body that does add so much motion to our figure as a whole. Now, as a final point, we also have the perspective, obviously, and the perspective comes into play as what most people know as foreshortening. So obviously having one arm come forward and the other arm move backwards, basically, we are obviously creating depth into the scene, because now this arm is further away than this arm, and that's clearly visible once again due to the overlap that we have. So that's why these 3 pointers are actually so heavily intertwined, because each one is counting on the other to work. Aside from that, obviously one leg moving forward and one leg moving backwards, also creating much depth in our figure, which is something that, once again, we think is desirable for a pose like this. Now here's what I would call a fairly beginner pose as well. I've seen many people kind of attempt to draw poses like this, and it's not necessarily undynamic, but there's definitely much to be desired. So in this case, you know, once again, all of the limbs basically are perfectly to the side. Nothing is really interacting with each other. From the moment you can just sort of outline a single limb without issue, we have a pose that probably doesn't really flow very well. So that's something that we want to fix by, once again, shifting that pose, maybe changing the camera angle and changing the positioning of our limbs in such a way that, once again, we are emphasizing those overlapping elements, so that I clearly have a front leg, a middle section, and then the back leg in this case. And the same thing for my shoulder being in front of my chest, being in front of my other shoulder. Once again, those 3 levels of depth are very clearly visible. With the head is obviously something that we can use quite intentionally as well. Quite often people tend to stay away from having the head actually overlap with the chest, but the head is probably something like, from the moment I'm bending forward, that head is gonna dive in between my shoulders, which is obviously gonna create a more dynamic looking pose as well, because now we don't only have 1, 2, 3 levels of depth, but we actually have another element kind of coming into play, so 4 levels of depth, which is much more interesting. Again, the foreshortening comes into play as well. Having this arm move forward creates something that's much more dynamic, but this is something we can do for any kind of pose that we are creating. Notice, by the way, the positioning of the feet. If we have our feet aligned on a certain level of depth, once again, that is basically canceling out the perspective, because now, like, they're basically stood just facing the camera, legs spread out in such a way that we can't really see which leg is more in front or which leg is more in the back. But by actually moving our feet apart from each other on that y-axis, suddenly we create a much more clear sense of depth once again. And this is because we're basically thinking about the ground plane that this character would be stood upon, right? So same thing over here. This character is obviously standing on the floor, so imagining almost like a floor tile that we're going to draw this character on should definitely help with creating something that, once again, feels more intentional, more believable, and once again has that level of depth. So these are some of the ways that we can actually use that depth to our advantage. So overlap, perspective, and rotation, very, very valuable to create those more dynamic looking poses. For the flow of our character, I'd like to talk about 3 other pointers. We have the action, we have the rhythm, and we have the balance of our pose. Now, these are in order of importance, in my opinion, although all of these principles are important, otherwise I wouldn't have mentioned them in this video. So we have the action, and the action is probably something that a lot of you guys are familiar with if you have done some research on figure drawing, because this refers to the line of action that most people are talking about. Now, personally, I'm cautious when talking about the line of action because I think it's one of the most misinterpreted parts of a figure drawing that most beginners tend to use. Because a line of action, like if I would ask a beginner to draw a line of action through these poses, you'd get all kinds of different results. Like someone would, for example, probably try to force like an S curve in there somewhere. Maybe they'd get like an S curve in here, and then they'd start thinking about, oh yeah, but I also have this curve, and trying to force it basically in between every single part of the figure, every single limb. And I think that is probably a flawed way to think about it, because this way we are breaking it up into too many separate parts. This isn't a line of action. This is basically just a bunch of lines that don't really add any value to the drawing. On the contrary, I think they might weaken your sketch as an end result. So what is the line of action? Well, it's quite literally in the name. So I'm trying to focus on what the actions are that are happening. So where most of the tension in the body would actually be. So something that I find useful is actually breaking up the line of action in separate parts rather than trying to force, once again, a single line in something that maybe isn't that present. So for this figure, for example, rather than having that S curve that flattens out or softens that transition that we have from the hips to the waist, this is, in my opinion, better to split up into two separate line of actions, because that's an angle. Like, that's a breaking point in our pose. This shouldn't really flow necessarily. This is being counteracted by that second line of action. Because on the one hand, we have the action of bending forward and upwards, but on the other hand, we have the action of moving my behind backwards so that I don't fall over, so that I don't fall on my face. So those are the two actions that are being done to balance out this pose. And you've noticed me using the word balance. Well, that's why balance is also something that's important and we're going to be discussing later. For this one, I try to focus on the supportive leg. I don't think this leg is very important for the gesture or for the action as a whole. I want to understand where the most weight is being carried and what is the most important part of the pose. So in this case, this foot is actually quite important. So that is actually where I would personally start by creating our pose. And I'd be tempted to also move this into two separate directions perhaps, or maybe we'd get something along the lines of that, where we once again have two actions working together, because we have that pinching point on the left hand side and that stretching point on the right hand side. And that's once again a breaking point in our pose. So whenever we have a very clear breaking point, I try to focus on creating those more angular lines of action. Now, in this case, we also have a very clear action that's sort of working against itself. Once again, it's kind of the flow being continued through having the head basically follow that curve that we already have. But keep in mind, once again, the actions that are being used to actually create these poses in particular. For this one, there's only one line that's really important, and that is actually just kind of line of moving forwards, the angle of the pose, that's important. And once again, these lines aren't necessarily very important to know and to have in your sketches, but these are something that you need to be aware of and you need to think about, because we want to portray energy in our pose. And this is why these lines of actions are actually useful, to get a clear sense of movement. The movement is the thing that we're trying to describe here with these lines. Same thing with perhaps these lines that we have over here. Like if we actually have a look at the things that I already had prepared, you can very clearly see that we will almost always, whenever we have that breaking point, have these two lines working against each other, because once again, they, in my opinion, describe best where the forces are happening and how the movement of these characters is occurring. Now, aside from the action, we have two other points that we want to keep in mind. We have the balance and the rhythm. And we can see in this case, like what that actually looks like. The rhythms are, in a sense, closely related to the lines of action, but they don't describe the actions that are happening. They basically just kind of describe the flow of the shapes. So for example, in this case, the rhythms are kind of describing the fact that I have my like my wedge shape almost of my backside of my leg that's sort of curving around, and then we have the butt that's also sort of curving around as well. That is being counteracted by a shape that is basically shifting directions in the opposite direction. So having those lines that are almost like, you know, hooks that are interchanging and shifting the direction of the pose, those are, in my opinion, the rhythms that we have over here. And you can see these rhythms, by the way, in anatomy as well. Like, for example, if you just kind of have a look at the way the arm is constructed, well, we have our deltoid moving into our biceps, moving into our forearm. And the forearm, or the arm itself, automatically has these rhythms as well that are very, very present. Same thing for the legs, for example. We would have the upper leg that has on the outside of the upper leg a very clear rhythm going inwards, being alternated by the medial quad, the medial vastus, that is once again changing the directions and kind of counteracting that first part of the rhythm. That would then be counteracted by the calf muscle. That would then be counteracted by the direction of the foot. So once again, we have these rhythms that are very clearly visible. Like even with the body as a whole, like let's grab the body from a side view, we can very clearly see these rhythms happening with something like the spine as well, for example, just kind of because of the orientation of all of the separate parts of our figure. And even the legs from a side view, by the way, we can also once again see those rhythms very clearly. So we have the back into the belly, into the butt, into the quad, into the calf. And these are the rhythms that we're talking about. And these rhythms will obviously change as we change positions, because the body is something that is amorphous, like it's able to basically change proportions. It's able to transform almost as muscles tense and muscles relax, and we move our body in different positions. So these rhythms might change every so often, but we're basically always looking for these lines that are kind of counteracting each other, that are catching each other. And once again, it's very similar to how we would decide flow in a composition and how we would arrange our elements in a illustration to actually create those more flowy compositions. So aside from the rhythms, as a final point, we also have the balance of our pose. And the balance is related to two separate terms. We have the center of mass, or the center of gravity, depending on who you ask, and we have the base of support. Now, to quickly define these, the center of mass is very easy to identify, because we basically just need to think about where the masses of our body are and where the median weight would be. Like, for example, if I have these masses perfectly next to each other and these would all be equal in size and equal in weight, my center of mass would be straight in the middle. But from the moment I'm moving this one closer by, my center of mass is also moving to the side, because it needs to be at the center of the weight distribution, basically. So we want to always have an idea of where those, once again, three main volumes that we discussed earlier are, so that we can identify where that center of mass would actually be located. So if my chest is slightly tilting to one side, then my center of mass will also move to that side where the chest is tilting. Now, why is that center of mass, or that center of gravity, so important? Well, this is basically the thing that's going to decide whether or not your character is standing in a stable position or an unstable position. In other words, if they're standing still or if they are actually moving. So when they are standing still, our center of gravity falls right in between our base of support, and our base of support is, well, it's kind of in the name. We have the base of support of our body. So in this case, the area in between our feet. That's usually the case. Now, if I would have a cane, like let's say we put a cane right there, and now my base of support is between my feet and my cane, right? Now, just keep in mind, as a general rule of thumb, the base of support is between our feet. So as long as this center of gravity lies between that base of support, then we have a stable position of a person standing still. So if I would be creating, once again, my shoulders and my hips, and I would want to think about how can I actually turn this into a stable pose? Well, from the moment I'm moving my legs too far to one side, like this character is falling over, and that's not obviously ideal. So you want to either move this leg like a little bit further apart, so that once again that center of gravity lies on the inside of that base of support. Or alternatively, we need to shift the weight of our body in one direction so that we're moving our center of gravity. So either you widen your base of support, or you move your center of gravity in order to create a stable looking pose. For the unstable positions, so when people are actually in motion, well, that's when we can actually intentionally move our base of support away from our center of gravity. So for example, the further our center of gravity is from our base of support, the more energy we have moving forward. So if a person is sprinting like this guy, then the base of support is way in front of our foot, because what is running is basically when we are falling over and catching ourselves with our other foot, right? And that is the action of running. It's me continuously catching myself as I'm falling forward. In this case, my base of support lies behind my foot, but it still feels like he would be at least slowing down in that direction, but he's still moving forward. Now, why is that? Because the pose, the context of the pose indicates that he was running forward, and he's now just shifting his weight in the opposite direction to either slow down or redirect himself to turn around. So that's how we can use the energy of our poses to add flow to our design, to our figures. So once again, we have the rhythm, we have the balance, and we have the action that is actually the most important part to create a nice sense of dynamic looking figures. So combining this with the idea of creating depth in our scene and having actually those overlapping elements, playing around with what's moving towards us, what's moving away from us, we will end up creating very, very nice looking and dynamic looking compositions and poses. One of the most fun exercises that I tend to fill pages and pages of my sketchbook with is actually what you see right in front of you on the screen right now. So the first step is going to be creating just chains of those three main volumes: our head, our torso, and our pelvis. Now, why are these three so important? Well, it's obviously because they kind of drive the entire pose of the character, and what connects those three elements is obviously going to be the spine, and the spine is the motor of any dynamic pose. So that's where a dynamic figure really begins. So we can start by filling our page with just chains of these three main volumes, and you can simplify them for your convenience into just boxes, because obviously boxes are much more easy to rotate in three-dimensional space. And then the next step is to just kind of come up with any combination of orientations, having the head look one way, having the torso look another way, having the pelvis look downwards, the head look upwards, etc. Whatever you can come up with is a good foundation. And you'll notice, as long as those are actually in a fairly interesting position, it almost doesn't matter what you do with the limbs. Where you want to add the limbs, that kind of ties into the flow part of the lesson of today. So for example, making sure that it feels nice and balanced, and making sure that we get those rhythms in our figures, and that will end up creating those nice and dynamic looking poses. Now, I'm also going to show you how I apply this information to these more complicated characters, these complicated poses, like for example in this case, one of the favorite things to draw of anyone who wants to experiment with poses, that's going to be Spider-Man. Spider-Man is very fun to play around with because he can be in any pose, like he's flipping around the city, so whatever orientation those limbs are, whatever direction the chest and the pelvis and the head is facing, it is probably going to work and feel believable for a Spider-Man drawing. So we begin once again with just the head, the torso, and the pelvis, and we use those as a foundation for the rest of the entire figure. Once we have those in place, once again, those limbs are actually not so important anymore. We just kind of want to keep the flow going. But having that overlap, having that sense of depth in our pose, that's what makes this pose so interesting. So once again, the one shoulder going in front of the chest and the chest going in front of the other shoulder, the head sinking in between the shoulders so that it's actually overlapping, the legs going in front of each other, like those are all elements that really help with creating these more three-dimensional looking poses that we can then expand upon with that anatomical detail. We're going to try to apply this to a new figure. And in this case, let's try to create something that's maybe a bit more dynamic even, and we really want to simplify a large chunk of the pose. So as you can see, from the shoulder to the hips, like that's just one straight line, well, one curve, basically, one uninterrupted line for the entire figure. From that point on, I just kind of start adding once again those steps that I've discussed earlier, starting with the head, the torso, and the pelvis, moving into the just general arrangement of the limbs before I actually get into detailing. Important is to wait with adding detail until you're actually satisfied with the construction of your figure, because if you take that extra step and if you slow down to create that accurate mannequin almost, you'll notice there's much less room to actually make a mistake, and your figures will start feeling much more believable if you take that step to think about that perspective, think about those overlapping features, like once again in this case the legs overlapping with each other, the arm going in front of the head. That's all just emphasizing the depth so well. So this is my favorite way to create any dynamic pose, and you can see me attempt this in our final pose as well in a second. But first, you know, I like to just bring these images to a little bit more of a finished result by just doing a general pass of like a little bit of lighting. Doesn't have to be very much, but you know, this is just kind of for presentation. Then we can move on to the final character. And we're gonna, in this case, do one that's maybe not floating in the air to prove that the balance actually is also quite important. So I still want the forward energy for this pose, like the chest going forward and the head and the chest kind of moving in the same direction. You can see that we have a very clear twist from the pelvis to the head as well, like an uninterrupted twisting movement of the entire torso. And if I've done things correctly, it will feel still like a fairly energetic pose. Another fun thing to play around with is obviously the shapes of the anatomy, kind of bringing some parts of the anatomy forward more, emphasizing certain features of the character to really play around with how dynamic we can make the individual features look. Because once you have your pose that works, the next step is obviously to actually make sure that the drawing of the anatomy is emphasizing that pose. So the musculature, the folds, even the hair, everything that is part of this drawing has been designed and composed in a way that should emphasize the flow and the depth of this drawing. So creating those overlapping features, even using the perspective on those swords, for example, those are all steps that I can use to create those dynamic looking poses. So I hope this really helped you guys out. I hope you have a clear idea on how you can actually apply this information, and I encourage you practice the exercise that I mentioned earlier quite often, because it is a very, very good exercise. And once you get to that point, you know, it starts becoming much more easy. Now, if you have any suggestions for a future Fundamentals Friday, feel free to leave a comment in the comment section. I do take a look at the comment section, so leave whatever suggestions you might have, and hopefully I'll see you in the next video. Take care.